So we're going to talk about the Kalam cosmological argument actually in the chapter that that I'm going through for this particular discussion. I'm trying to look, but I think I came across, I did. William Lane Craig is the philosopher who wrote the book. It's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument in 1979. William Lane Craig is a philosopher. And he offers, it says, a contemporary defense of the argument and argues for the existence of God with an emphasis on the alleged metaphysical impossibility of an infinite regress of past events. And so, but he comes up, and I'm gonna, since I'm here, I'm gonna read something and then we'll get back to it. It says, when we turn to the Gospels, we find, this is William Lane Craig, the same guy who talks about the cosmological argument. It says, when you turn to the Gospels, we find multiple independent attestations of the burial story. Now, he's talking about cosmology there, but he's talking about, he comes up actually in our discussions here about the evidence for the resurrection. It says, and Joseph of Arimathea is specifically named in all four accounts. On top of that, the burial story in Mark is so extremely early that it is simply not possible for it to have been subject to legendary corruption. When you read the New Testament, there's no doubt that the disciples sincerely believed the truth of the resurrection, which they proclaimed to their deaths. I'll talk a little bit about that later. The idea that the empty tomb is a result of some hoax, conspiracy, or theft is simply dismissed today. So we're going to spend a little time talking about evidence for the resurrection. So I think last week we talked about the expansion of the universe and the constant of that expansion and how important it was to understand what that meant and why it was so important to understand that the expansion of the universe expands at a rate that allows for things like gravity. The things that are needed to create life. And they talked a lot about, without some of the things that are going on with the universe's expansion, that we would not be able to, without gravity, of course, nothing would sit on the ground. Things would float everywhere, much like when you look at stories related to when people go to the moon and you see these stories of people on the moon bouncing and up and down because there's less gravity there than here. But gravity, the expansion of the universe allows gravity at a rate necessary for life. And so now they talked a little bit about the rate of expansion of the universe, but this time they talked about that had to be a cause. And I will tell you that when I look at that, I'm trying to get a little bit of additional light here, but when I look at that, when I think of a concept of a Big Bang, if we were to go there, and you can call it what you will, but when I think of that, I think about the beginning of the universe. If everything was so compact, has a cause, it expands at a rate that's necessary. The further out, the faster it expands. That period would have been, if we want to call it a bang, would be the beginning of that moment when God said, "Let there be," and it was. But the thing that was quite interesting to me was the beginning when it talked about the very famous equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass, mc, mass and constant squared. It talks about equals mc squared, and how these earlier scientists were really struggling with this whole notion of a universe that expands. But as they were looking at the science, it's literally where the science led them, even though they did not really want to believe it. The evidence based on the science put them where they are. And that's one of the things that I like about Lee Strobel and some of the scientists. If you would read the book, The Case for the Creator, it comes up where individuals were saying that some of these scientists are believers, and that's why they're saying the things that they say. And many of them, when he interviewed them, were quite upset about that particular notion, because their argument was, in science, evidence matters. Evidence must be replicable, and we can replicate the evidence. Let the evidence take us where it takes us. And it may not always take us where we want to go, but it doesn't change the fact that that's where it's led us. And so as we're finding more and more of this evidence in all of these varying disciplines, we did physics last week, cosmology today. We talked about biological evidence and archaeological evidence before, talking about the miracle of the machine that is our body and DNA and our cells and how they work, and the archaeological evidence out there that leads to a period, not single-celled organisms found in the historical record or in the archaeological record that are becoming more and more complex over time, but a very significant period in time when all of these things are found all over the world in a range of time already very complex. And the more they search earlier, they don't find any of that. That's the Cambrian Explosion we talked about before. So archaeological evidence is pointing to a moment where God would have said, let there be, crawling things on the earth. And that's when it happened. And they're finding in the archaeological evidence at periods. And when they look back, if Darwin was correct, you would find less complex organisms before that time, and they don't find them. And so archaeological evidence is pointing, biological evidence is pointing. Darwin's theory I mentioned before, where Darwin said, if you find anything reduced to its least complex form, as anything more than a single-celled organism, my argument doesn't hold. And they found that in the cell, the motor of the cell that produces life, that cannot be any less complex. That term, if you're writing notes, is irreducible complexity, that you cannot reduce it to any less complex than this particular moment. It is more than a single cell organism. It is a cell of more than 40 different organisms that without all of those cells, the motor doesn't work. And so you hear me say that God has allowed man to set the rules. Man says that science is the evidence that we can trust. If we can't show it scientifically, we can't trust it. And so I believe God let man set the rules and said, all right, is that the rule? Are you ready? And now he's showing us through science himself. I believe that Darwin and all these other earlier scientists who were looking for answers, trying to find out what they can, trying to understand what they could. And there were some folk who were dishonest in those periods too. Some scientists who were not being honest with what they were finding. But when they were not being honest, other scientists contemporary to them checked them on it and said that we know what you just put out there is not true. And so the challenge for us is much like for them is to go where the evidence takes us. And I believe that many of them were simply looking for the truth of their academic pursuits. But today, we have so much more information at our disposal, so much more better technology at our disposal than they had at theirs. And now, as a result of it, we know more than we knew then. And evidence now is pointing in a different direction. I'll say this here, that there were times, you may remember about 30 years ago or so, when there was this push to push what was called intelligent design in schools as a competing theory with evolution. And people were fighting that. And Georgia was one that says we are going to be an evolution only state in our classrooms. And people were arguing that the church was trying to push Genesis in the classroom. But I come to let you know that that's not what was going on. what was actually happening was there was this series of hundreds of scientists who were saying that there's evidence out here that points us in a different direction, and we should push the theory of intelligent design as a competing academic scientific theory to evolution. And the way the fighters against it fought it was they said it was the church trying to push Genesis, when it was not the church trying to push Genesis. It was the scientific community or segments of the scientific community that were looking at the evidence saying, there is evidence that leads us to believe that there is another more plausible explanation to the origins of the universe. And so the challenge for us is to look at the evidence and see where it takes us and make that determination of what you believe. But I believe, looking at the things that I've looked at, reading the things that I've read, that there's just overwhelmingly more evidence to prove evolution over creation. When I was doing some of these studies in college, I had a scientist, something I read that said, there are millions of years of gaps in the evolutionary story of trying to connect, earliest creatures, if you will, to this evolutionary story leading to man. And this one scientist said that if we're honest in the scientific community, we are closing those million-year gaps with faith. We simply believe that we're going to find something in the evidence that closes the gaps. What I said then when I read that was, I can respect that scientist, because what he was actually saying is that we're using the same faith mechanisms to believe what we don't see and what we can't prove as people who are believing what people in creation can't prove, that we're closing those gaps with faith. But now, as we're looking more and more at scientific evidence, it is pointing more and more in the direction of an intelligent designer outside of the universe that set it in motion. And so that's why you look at the Kalam cosmological argument that ends with the logical ending that the universe has a cause of its existence.